So we'll now turn to our next panel, philosophical and sociological perspectives. We have two speakers, that's David Pilgrim and Michael Biggs. David Pilgrim is Honorary Professor of Health and Social Policy, University of Liverpool, and Visiting Professor of Clinical Psychology at the University of Southampton. His recent books include Critical Realism for Psychologists and Child Sex Abuse, Moral Panic or State of Denial. And currently David's working on a book on identity politics. So David, I'll ask you now to talk to us. The Curate's Egg of Identity Politics, a critical realist examination. Thank you, David.
So as David Bell's just said, this reflects my current thoughts on a book I'm writing on identity politics. And I've sort of started with the conclusion really, which is that identity politics is a curate's egg. And I'll expand on that a little bit at the end. So my aims are to do four things really. Say something empirically about what identity politics is, what's its social ontology, if you like. I don't want to give a tight definition. People argue about definitions, but I will introduce some working ideas about what it looks like, which you could probably all agree on. The second thing I'm going to do is say a little bit about critical realism for those who don't know about it. And then I'm going to move to a third aim, which is to look at the conditions of possibility for identity politics. It's interesting this term conditions of possibility is shared by both critical realists and postmodernists as well, which is, what did the world look like for us to see what we're seeing before us at the moment, or talk about what we're talking about, the question of emergence. And then finally, in the midst of writing this book, I'm coming to some conclusions, learning points about identity politics, lessons drawn, and I want to share those with you at the end for discussion. The features of identity politics. You start really with it being closely aligned with new social movements, which emerged largely in the 1960s. But there are a particular subgroup of new social movements which are about identity to do with subgroups of human beings. For instance, we can distinguish ecology or the anti-nuclear movement from feminism or gay politics. Okay. So it's not conflatable with new social movements, but closely aligned. And linked to that, identity then emerges from two sources, I think. One is our born characteristics. So if you're born with a black skin or you're born with a penis, then that's from day one is going to start shaping who you think, how you think about yourself. But then the post-hoc identity amplification or consolidation or confusion comes in when you start talking to other people. So, for example, if you were to join a particular social movement, that will then amplify and get you to think more deeply about your identity, and maybe also intensify it. So the sources are varied in terms of our own sense of who we are. There's certainly a focus within identity politics recurrently upon what is called epistemological privilege. This idea that the knowledge I have of myself born out within my own biography is special and can be privileged, particularly if I'm oppressed. And therefore we have this very strong rhetorical focus within all forms of identity politics on lived experience, this term lived experience. That's another empirical feature of it. This brings with it a tendency, and it is a tendency, and it varies in intensity, this, for a suspicion or hostility towards outgroup members. So if you're not in the club, you're outside, you're dealt with some suspicion and maybe just seen as the enemy. It varies this. We just need to acknowledge that this is a dynamic, and I'll come back to the question of group dynamics later. And with that comes the tendency to be angry and self-righteously outraged about your sense of oppression, with unending moralizations. And this then triggers these events like calling out, cancelling, no platforming. So in the most intense and organized forms, these actually then can lead to these moralizations. Somebody's just put on chat, can experience be anything other than lived? It's a good question. Probably not, but it is the term that is used. And with those moralizations and calling out and cancellations and no platforming, this can also occur now virtually. So we get this phenomenon clicktivism. All you need to do is sit in front of a computer and just, it's a binary decision. I'm for or against this. And you build up a sense of identity, possibly online even. You don't have to actually do it in the drafty corridors of normal politics. It can just be done online. So there's some of the initial features to think about. So if we go to the next slide, I've been using critical realism as a resource for this exercise. And for those who have not come across critical realism, I'll tell you briefly what it is. It was led mainly by an Anglo-Indian philosopher, Roy Bhaskar, who died in 2015. And it has three main axioms. The first is ontological realism, which is the axiom that the world exists independent of me or you. The world will still be there when I'm dead, when you're dead. At the end of the Anthropocene, when the whole species is dead, the world will carry on whirling. This goes back to Heraclitus, the idea that reality is in flow and in flux. But the second axiom is that because human beings have a large cerebrum and evolution is now bequeathed as language, we talk about reality consistently once we get language. We talk about it, we write about it, we argue about it, we construe and we reconstrue the world. And this is what's called epistemological relativism. And it's at this point that we get the sticky point that Heather raised about language. Because what postmodernism has done is actually just stay with this point. And it's important. Language is important, of course, but it's not all important because there are extra discursive powers that operate in our lives, which are not to do with language, which influences continuously. And the third general axiom from CR is judgmental rationalism. That is, we use our good faith and our good sense to weigh up evidence and decide whether something is true or not. And of course, truth has become a dirty word in postmodernism, but critical realists stick with it. For example, you could say that in Germany in the 1930s and 40s that there was depopulation in that country, or you could say that the Nazi state systematically murdered 6 million Jews. Now, the second statement is true, or it's truer than the first. So we can play with reality with words, but at the end of it all, we still have to make our best shot at what is true. Doesn't mean there are permanent truths. So this is not like positivism, which is looking for lawfulness. It's just saying at this moment, this seems to be the case. That's what judgmental rationalism is. Now, an emergent framework from CR is the four-plane of social being, which I'm going to explain because it's relevant to the question around transgenderism and identity politics in general. This suggests that reality is stratified, and we can think about it in these four planes. The first is our relationship to the natural world, including our bodies. So hence the biological reality of sex. If anybody's in doubt of that, look at the mortality figures at the moment on COVID-19, where men are twice as likely to die as women. There's a good reason for that, is that the male body tends to have a different immune response to women. So that's just a very obvious example. So we do have to consider our relationship with the natural world. The second level, though, is our relationship with one another, relationality. From the moment we're conceived, we relate to another human being. When we're born, we start to relate to others. And our mental and physical health and existence is contingent upon our relationship with others until we die. So relationality is very important. The third level is relationship to social and economic structures, so that we are thrown into a world which we don't know, we often don't understand. We could die not understanding it, but social structures, the economic arrangements of capitalism, patriarchy, colonialism, these social structures that Heather was talking about earlier are important to consider, and we may or may not understand them. Although I'm from a qualitative social science background, I don't actually believe that we can simply understand the world by taking personal accounts. It's a window into society, but it's not the building, because often social reality is absent from us, but it's continuously impinging upon us at the same time. And finally, the final layer is that We do have unique biographies and we do have unique experiences. We're all unique human beings. Now, why is this relevant? The relevance of this for identity politics is that it's driven by an unbalanced focus on planes 2 and 4, which is relationality and personal experience. And to emphasize, I'm not saying they're not important. What I'm saying, though, is that unless we also invoke our understanding of the natural world and social and economic structures which are not immediately present, we will not get a comprehensive understanding of what's going on in terms of power in the world. It will simply fail, or it will lead to a distorted account, if you like. Okay, so what were the conditions of possibility for identity politics? Well, the grievances around it go back to the 19th, arguably the 18th century. But the term identity politics, many of you will know, was actually coined by the Combahee River Collective, Black feminists, in 1977. But actually organized grievances around race, class, and sex were there in the 19th century. Faced first wave feminism, abolitionism around slavery, social democracy, the rise of the decriminalization of trade unions, the rise of Marxism. These represented a progressive push, what Roy Bascott called the pulse of freedom at the turn of the 20th century. The problem was, as soon as it hit the 20th century, grim reality struck in terms of the recoil of colonialism and capitalism. Hence, we got the First World War, 40 million casualties, 20 million dead in the last imperial war in Europe, for instance. We had the Russian Revolution, betrayed. So this starts a narrative then during the 20th century of heroic defeat. Most of the claims of the left, I think, are of a heroic defeat. This is what Eric Hobsbawm called the century of blood in an age of extremes. And it went on. So the general strike of 1926, failure. The failure of the German left to stop the rise of Nazism. The victory of Franco in the Spanish Civil War. The Second World War, the Holocaust in the 1950s, genocide, and wars continued. And then eventually we got the assassination of Martin Luther King. So there's this unending, depressing recoil against the pulse of freedom. And then in the last part of the 20th century, we got this new opportunity. We could start to think about power differently. Rather than get bogged down in the structural explanations and strategies, we can think about it mainly in terms of language, which Heather alluded to earlier, the focus in postmodernism on language. And this then blended, I think, with a very receptive culture in North America, which was American individualism. And I think these two together then formed these conditions of possibility for the flowering of different new social movements and within identity politics. And there are two things there to note. One is the focus on language. It's the way you talk about things that's all important. And second is moral voluntarism. This idea that as individuals, we can be anything we want to be. A few years ago, I remember seeing a T-shirt on somebody which said, I can be anything I want to be. And I thought to myself, no, you can't. But actually, we've reached a cultural moment now where people actually do believe that. And so this is the sort of flavor of what happened when we brought together postmodern thought and American individualism. And of course, this came along with, quite understandably, with the embedding expectations of citizenship under representative democracies. This is quite understandable. If you have a representative democracies, which going back to the Constitution of the United States in 1787 or the French Declaration of Rights of Man in 1789, if you tell people that they're all going to be equal and they've got equal rights, of course people then going to say, well, I'm not getting this and I'm going to complain and protest about it. It's perfectly understandable. So it culminates in these new social movements. These are the conditions. And I want to just say a little bit about where this leaves us really. What are the lessons about identity politics that I'm coming across as I'm writing the book? I think the first general point I'd make is about a spectrum of legitimacy in identity politics, that it isn't black and white. It is a curate's egg. You know, one end of that spectrum, we have sex-based rights claims, we have anti-racism, we have global campaigns to eradicate poverty. These are strongly located in objectively definable and measurable forms of oppression in society. And therefore they've got high legitimacy. The problem is that if you only go with those two planes of the interpersonal and the personal, you also let in a shed load of other claims, rhetorical claims. For example, paedophiles, incels, feudal theocrats. You know, there's a load of other people will say, well, I've got an identity. We're part of a group. We want citizenship. And this creates a tension. There is this spectrum. And I do think we need to reflect on that. And hence why it's not a black and white issue, this. It is a curate's egg. The second general point I'd make about it is that it's divisive across the political spectrum. Now, there's quite a lot of discussion going on at the moment in fora I'm involved with, which suggests that this is a crisis for the left, and in some ways, I think it is. But you know, let's not forget that some of the divisions, for instance, in the Conservative Party in Britain about the Gender Recognition Act have been between Tories. This has been also been an internal dispute within Toryism, because the liberal dimension to this, which was mentioned earlier by Julie, just goes right across the political spectrum. The notion of liberal with a small LME. And so people will sort of just say, well, yeah, let's live and let be, you know, diversity is good, etc. And therefore, inevitably, you're going to get spats about this, whatever political stable you come from. But I do think it's caused a particular crisis for the left, because it's been hijacked by it, and it's forgotten materiality by this lopsided analysis about the interpersonal and the personal. For example, it's been so destructive in the Labour Party. Two main things in the last 5 years, for those who are not from Britain, if you don't know this. One has been about anti-Semitism, and the other has been about women's officers and whether trans women should be women's officers. It's still unresolved, this, you know. So identity politics then brings in this divisiveness, really, and it sets people against one another who actually, under other circumstances and across a load of other agendas, would agree with one another. But somehow it's been extremely divisive, this question of identity politics. So my third general point is that we need to look at psychology, paradoxically. So although I'm complaining that identity politics is coloured too much by a form of reductionism, a focus on the interpersonal and the personal, actually we need more psychology to understand, not less. Now, we've got a number of resources to do that. One of them is the psychodynamic tradition, you know, going back to Freud, 1935, on defense mechanisms. Beyond on group dynamics. One of the contributors earlier mentioned, for instance, the notion of omnipotence. So there's plenty to chew on, really, in relation to the canon of psychodynamic writings, which actually tell us a lot about the mass psychology of why we make rigid, fixed, split decisions, why we think in black and white terms, why we project our animosity onto other people and turn them into enemies, why we are violent at times, etc. And actually, this is now aligned with some agreement within cognitive science. So, for example, there's a very interesting book I've just read by Keith Dutton, which is called Black and White Thinking. And cognitive scientists are pointing out that for evolutionary reasons, we have one mode of thinking, which is instinctive and very rapid fire, and actually has survival value, which is whether something's an enemy or not, for example, whether something's true or false. Is somebody going to throw a spear at me or not? You know, so judgments made very rapidly, which are black and white and rigid, have helped us survive. The problem is that it can also distort our thinking, because we do have a second way of thinking, which is slow, deliberative, which contains contradictions, which accepts ignorance, which is a form of thinking which, if you like, allows us to calmly reflect on the world and what it's about and our relationship to one another. that way of thinking is there as well. The sad thing is that identity politics has skewed our way of doing politics to the first mode of thinking. Okay, and as I say, it's not that we're not all prone to that mode of thinking, but I think it's actually biased us towards it, towards that form of thinking, and it doesn't allow us to think more calmly about the world in its nuanced and grey way. For example, the moral philosopher Susan Neiman has written about this in her book called Moral Clarity, which is psychological maturity should involve us being patient, being deliberative, talking to one another, accepting we don't know everything, and actually listening to other people calmly, and being prepared to say you're wrong and change your mind. That's okay as well. Okay. So it's within that frame that we need to think about psychology, I think, in a new way when we're thinking about identity politics. The third general point I'd make is in relation to the Enlightenment project. And this isn't to idealize the Enlightenment. It had a lot wrong with it. So I'm not saying we should unconditionally defend it, but I do think the legacy of it is something that we actually give away at our peril. I think if we abandon our confidence in science and we become anti-science, we've got problems. I think if we abandon our confidence in reasonable debate, we've got problems. And certainly if we abandon our commitment to freedom of expression, we've got problems. And I think this trio, which are the legacy of the Enlightenment project, my own view is whatever part of the political spectrum you're on, we should actually defend unconditionally. I'll come back to that in point 6. Before I do that, I want to also say something about the alignment of identity politics with neoliberalism, because I think a question was asked earlier about radicalism, that identity politics, particularly in the young now, is associated with social justice movements, hence critical social justice. And it's just seen as like a good thing. We all sign up to it. We're all into diversity at all costs, for example, and inclusivity. The problem with it is that because it's skewed towards this biased psychological reductionism, it completely untroubles neoliberalism. Consumer capitalism has no problem at all with identity politics. It can target demographics like the gay pound and the pink pound, for example. If you look at, if you're into the mass psychosis of watching football on telly, which I am, you'll see in the top corner of Sky Sports, Black Lives Matter. And you'll hear the commentators say when they take the knee at the beginning of every match, it's important that we root out racism in football. And you then think, okay, there's nothing wrong with those sentiments, fine. But how come an organization like Sky is happy to promote those messages? What's going on there? And the answer is, it doesn't actually trouble the fundamental questions around social and economic relationships in our current society. It's completely untroubled by it. It's easy to commodify it, in other words. Okay, so by the way, just as an aside on that, somebody told me recently, I don't know if this is true, that a few months ago, Netflix pulled the episode in Fawlty Towers about the Germans. Those of you who watch Fawlty Towers will know the German sketch. And they pulled it apparently not because anybody complained, but they were worried that actually it would affect their profits. So you can even anticipate this now. So the marketing involves anticipating, causing offense. Okay, so that's the question of alignment with neoliberalism. And so that leaves me with my final point, really, which is where does it leave us in terms of what we should do next? And again, that was a question raised earlier for feminism, but I think it's a general question for identity politics, really. And if representative politics is something we should defend, but it's got its faults, certainly it's got its faults. I mean, representative democracy produced Adolf Hitler and Donald Trump. So it's no fail-safe mechanism at all. We have to then think about it. And I understand why identity politics was a response to that sense of frustration from below in civil society about the failings of identity politics and careerist politicians working in bureaucracies. I get that completely. But I think it's been a false start. And I think really The real answer, which we have to explore, is some form of deliberative democracy or direct democracy. And we have somebody asked about changing higher education. There's lots written on this already. This is not new. We've got the Frankfurt School. We've got Eric Fromm writing on the Sane Society. We've got Jürgen Habermas on communicative action. And particularly, I would commend one of his followers, Axel Honneth, in his book Disrespect. There are very, very clear and sophisticated ways of thinking about the personal in its social context, which this allows us to do. We've got Gramsci, we've got the anarchist writers like David Graeber, the historian, and Noam Chomsky, the philosopher. All of these have produced enormous amounts of work on this notion of what democracy means. But I would probably, Nancy Fraser's work, for instance, on feminism, Fortunes of Feminism, all these are written about this. My own favorite, but it's just happens to appeal to me about the way she writes, is Hannah Arendt, particularly her work on the human condition and the promise of politics, because it was Arendt who had the grounded experience as a Jewish woman escaping Germany when she was an anti-fascist that then led her to understand authoritarianism after the Second World War. That experience gave her confidence to write, often in an unpopular way, by the way, about what she saw as the threat to real democracy. And she believed in this notion of what she called action, which we should throw ourselves with our fellow human beings in a spirit of constructiveness and respect to experiment with new ways of being. That's what she meant by action. And it's on that sort of optimistic note, I think I would finish really and put that forward as an alternative to the false start of identity politics. So thank you for listening.
So we'll now move on to the next paper. I'll introduce firstly Dr. Michael Biggs. Michael is an associate professor of sociology at the University of Oxford and a fellow of St. Cross College. His research focuses on social movement and collective protest from strike waves in the 19th century to transgenderism in the 21st. I'll hand over to you, Michael, to give your paper. We've just given a rather general title, A Sociocultural Perspective.
Great. Okay, thank you. So let me start off with a very simple and very crude formulation. That queer theory plus social media plus puberty blockers gives you the transgender child. And by this, of course, I'm not talking about gender dysphoria, which I think is probably universal although at a varying rate. So I'm not saying that this creates gender dysphoria, but I think it does provide the kind of phenomenon that we're talking about here of the transgender child. And we've talked a lot, already mentioned queer theory and Judith Butler quite a few times. Heather, among others, mentioned this. And I think I want to talk in this talk about puberty blockers and about another mother, if you like, of transgenderism, that is Peggy Cohen-Kettenis. So my argument is really developing an argument that was made by Hausman just before the current era of kind of transgenderism. And she argues, I think convincingly, that transsexualism emerged in the 20th century, at least in part due to advances in medical technologies that made physical sex change possible. And of course, she had in mind there cross-sex hormones and plastic surgery. So that made that era of transsexualism possible. And I think we can extend her argument to say that puberty blockers have been central to making the transgender child as we know them today possible. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of the Dutch origins of puberty blockers in the 1990s, along with some kind of reflections about the way the puberty blockers have been a technology which doesn't just involve drugs and their physical effects, but also a whole sort of discursive package of rhetoric, which has been very important as well. So when I say technology, I don't just mean the physical technology, but also the discourse as well. So just to be clear about what we mean by puberty blockers, and puberty blockers is already part of the discursive package, because in some sense it's a euphemism to refer to a particular class of drugs, gonadotropin releasing hormone agonists, which shut down the production of sex hormones. If you're from America, you'll be familiar with Lupron, but actually in Britain and in the Netherlands, we use a different drug called triptorelin, although it has the same function. These have never been licensed for gender dysphoria, of course. What they've been licensed for, they first developed for precocious puberty in children, and they've also been licensed for a few diseases that are linked to sex hormones, like, for example, prostate cancer in men. One interesting use for which they are licensed is for severe sexual deviation in men. So they're used to chemically castrate sex offenders. And it's interesting to read the two literatures side by side, the gender medicine literature and the literature on the chemical castration of sex offenders, because although it's the same drug, they're viewed in very different ways. So what was this wonderful drug that allows the child to discover their true self, and the gender medicine becomes a much more a drug with much more negative side effects in the literature on sex offenders. So in this recent review says that these GnRHA drugs should be reserved for patients with a paraphilic disorder and the highest risk of sexual offending because of their extensive side effects. And you might think, well, maybe it's because the children are being given much lower doses of the drugs. The drugs are the same, but the doses are different. But in actual fact, the doses are the same. So in effect, this is this is literally chemical castration for males anyway. So the use of these drugs to treat children with gender dysphoria comes from the Netherlands. And the first article that floats this idea is by Curate and Delmar van der Waal, The Feasibility of Endocrine Interventions in Juvenile Transsexuals. And I've underlined that phrase because I think that's an important term there, juvenile transsexuals. The second article, which is more influential, was by Cohen-Kettenis and Van Kozen, Pubertal Delay as Diagnosis and Treatment of a Transsexual Adolescent. Again, transsexual adolescent is a concept to remember. And this was particularly influential because it gave a case study of a patient who had been treated. This is the first patient we know of that has been treated for gender dysphoria with gonadotropin-releasing hormone agonist. So B had always been a classical tomboy in her play activities and in her toy and peer preference, and she wished to be a boy. The fact that the father was from Italy and had more traditional views of gender made acceptance of his daughter's masculinity very difficult, and there was conflict between B and her father. She was prescribed triptorelin at the age of 13. It's unclear who did it, but I suspect, reading between the lines, that it was Delmar van der Waal. This was, of course, completely experimental. Then she went on, aged very quickly from the age of 18, to take testosterone, to have a double mastectomy, have her ovaries and uterus removed, genital surgery, and changing her legal sex. And the report that Cohen-Kettenis and Van Kozen provide is, it seems like a magical cure, because B reported no gender dysphoria at all. He said that he had found the adjustment to the male role to be very easy. And most importantly, he really looked good. He really looked like a handsome young man, and there was no trace of the female in his physical appearance. So you can see why the second article was so influential in gender medicine. It seemed to provide the holy grail of a real sex change. So just to explore the motivations, the sort of intellectual motivations behind puberty blockers, there are two key figures. The first is Curate, who's an endocrinologist and proudly called himself the world's first professor of transsexology at the Free University of Amsterdam. He was in the tradition of John Money. John Money, the great New Zealand sexologist who invented gender in the 1950s. And as Curate said, he long counted myself among John Money's admirers. So his idea was simply that transsexuals really were intersexed and they had the wrong brain. As he said, in transsexuals, the pattern of sexual differentiation, the brain has not followed the pattern typical of that sex. The chromosomes, the gonadal and genital development are in contradiction with the brain sex. So we can't change the person's brain, we have to change the body to match the brain. And this quotation is taken from a real landmark congress that he organized at the Free University of Amsterdam, which is absolutely central in bringing together all the major players of the next quarter century. Those of you in England will know Whittle and Christine Burns. Stephen Whittle has already been mentioned by Julie Bindel. Whittle and Burns first met at this congress. Christine Burns was inspired to become an activist by Horan's speech. And if those of you listening from America, Martine Rothblatt was there and gave a presentation. So there's an interesting, this is sort of a digression, but there's an interesting side note about the way medical professionals like Horan were instrumental in changing the law. And Horan is an expert witness in many court cases, pushing for the legal change that became the 2004 Gender Recognition Act. So that's Horan. The second, of course, major figure is Cohen Kettenis. She's a psychiatrist at Utrecht who started the first children's gender clinic in Europe in 1987. And her perspective was more practical. She wanted to help these children who came to her, and she thought that the sooner you intervened, the better. And she emphasized early hormone treatment as a reasonable and effective treatment option for adolescents with a transsexual problem, and emphasized the potentially damaging effects of delaying such interventions. So, of course, the problem, of course, is that she's already shifted this from 18 to 16, but 16 is a barrier. You can't consent. In the Netherlands, you couldn't consent to this kind of treatments below the age of 16. Puberty blockers provided the solution to that problem. And I should say that, just to wrap up the kind of connection with John Money, is that when Cohen Kettenis, this quote from Cohen Kettenis comes from a book, and Money writes the preface to this, and he says that Cohen Kettenis's chapter is the bravest chapter. So he gives us imprimatur to this development. So the Horan and Cohen Kettenis and their co-authors create the Dutch protocol, which means that at 12 you become eligible for puberty blockers as soon as you reach Tanner stage 2, which is early puberty. 16, cross-sex hormones. 18, you have your surgeries. And the Dutch are very clear. This is a conveyor belt. Once you hit 18, you have all the surgeries in a quick succession. There are some quite supposedly strict eligibility criteria, which I won't go into. What's important to underline is that when the Dutch protocol was imported to other countries, they pretty clearly ignored the eligibility criteria, which they also, the Dutch kept 12 as the minimum age, but of course the logic of puberty suppression is to start off whenever the child hits puberty, and if that's younger than 12, you go younger than 12. So in Britain, of course, we have had children as young as 10 taking puberty blockers. The point of the Dutch protocol is to create a transsexual who passes much better. As to quote, the results of the Dutch protocol is in high percentages of individuals who more easily pass into the opposite gender role than when treatment commenced well after the development of secondary characteristics. And as a kind of an outsider reading this literature, what's striking is the emphasis on appearance, on passing, rather than sexuality or fertility, which are rather downplayed. So the emphasis is really on looking good with your clothes on, looking, as like the opposite sex, rather than actually what your body can do. It's rather how your body looks that is crucial to the Dutch protocol and the rationale for puberty blockers. Oh, just a side note, of course, this was funded by the pharmaceutical company that manufactures triptylin. So as I said, this is not just a kind of set of drugs and a protocol. This is also a series of kind of rhetorical tricks that are very good for sort of fudging the question of consent. So the two tricks that are most useful are, first of all, this rhetoric of reversibility. So in the first article, Horan and Delmar van der Waal say, the effects of GnRHA are fully reversible. In other words, no lasting undesired effects are to be expected. And of course, that verbal formulation shows that, of course, there's no evidence to back this up. It's just what we know about the endocrine system suggests that there won't be any undesired effects. And of course, there's also a real sleight of hand here, because if you take triptorelin for a month and then stop, of course, there'll be no discernible difference. But we're not talking about a month. We're talking about 3 years. And of course, as the age of puberty block is lowered in other countries, it's become up to 5 or 6 years. And there's no reason to think, in fact, good reason to think that will not. There's no reason to think that will have no effect, permanent effect, even if you stop. But of course, this is crucial for justifying starting under the normal age of medical consent, because you can say, well, the children don't need to consent to any permanent changes because puberty blockers aren't permanent. The second rhetorical trick is to say that this is a diagnosis. This is not just a treatment, or not entirely only a treatment. This is a diagnostic tool. As they say, it's a very helpful diagnostic aid as it allows the psychologist and the patient to discuss problems that possibly underlie the cross-gender identity, which maybe this was a genuine belief at the outset. However, the same article also says later on, none of the patients who are selected for pubertal suppression has decided to stop taking GnRHA. However, that fact does not change the rhetoric. It's still viewed as being a diagnostic tool. And it's, I think, probably the only diagnostic tool in medicine that always gives one result, which is you have a juvenile transsexual, and they need to go on eventually to cross-sex hormones and surgeries. And this is the case not just in the Netherlands, but in every other country as well. 99, 97, 98% of children who start on puberty blockers go on to cross-sex hormones. There's also, as well as these rhetorical tricks, there's also one very significant erasure, and that is the erasure of homosexuality. So an advantage of doing a close reading of the early work is to find little traces, little kind of buried traces that have disappeared in the more recent literature. So in this first article by her in 1996, says not all children with gender atypicality will turn out to be transsexuals later in life. Several prospective studies of gender atypical boys show that this childhood behavior correlates considerably stronger with future homosexuality than with transsexualism. And of course, this raises the question, well, why are we treating these kids as juvenile transsexuals? Later, just a few sentences later, they say some of the youngsters will turn out to be genuinely transsexual in their mid-teens. But of course, the Dutch protocol starts them off in the early teens and treats basically all of the youngsters as genuinely transsexual. And I haven't seen any kind of resolution of this contradiction. Virtually the same passage appears in an article by Cohen-Kett and Curate in 1999, and then this sort of drops out, and it's never mentioned again. And of course, we now have even more better evidence of that cross-sex gender behavior in childhood leads to adults who are far more likely to be gay or lesbian or bisexual. And yet this is kind of just simply swept under the carpet within this discourse on puberty blockers. One other very specific erasure is worth noting, and that is undercuts the kind of rationale of making it easier to become a transsexual, and that's for males. That in the genital surgery for males, what is used to line the new orifice that is created is the penis. However, puberty suppression has the major disadvantage of creating an adolescent with a very small boy's penis, which of course is not enough for a vaginoplasty. This wasn't acknowledged for a long time. I think it's first acknowledged in 2008. And then, of course, the Dutch just simply say, well, it's not a big problem. We can use some other surgical techniques. The alternative is to use a piece of the patient's bowel to line the neovagina. But I think that's a much less satisfactory surgery. Again, this kind of quite a significant disadvantage for males is not emphasized at all. In terms of course, as in Britain, we're interested in the way it comes to Britain, and there's a very important film, a documentary television program by Channel 4 called The Decision, The Wrong Body, which comes out in 1996. So it comes out very early. 1996, remember, is just the year that the first sort of medical article was written by Curate. And these documentary makers, this is a 2-hour program, it's a really in-depth program. They take 3 British females to the Netherlands, and they meet there. They meet Cohen-Kettenis, they meet Horan, and the star of the show is Fred, the youngest, who is age 13. And the documentary presents this as kind of, Fred has this ticking time bomb of puberty waiting, and if only she could have these treatments that are offered in the Netherlands, she would of course be able to transition. So Fred talks to her and talks to Cohen-Kettenis, meets some of their young trans men and says, they look like normal boys. Why can't I be a normal boy like that? It's interesting that an interesting sidelight is that Curate actually says to Fred's mother, I'll give you a prescription for puberty blockers. So even back then, he was quite willing to prescribe puberty blockers to people, to patients in a different country. This television program was watched by 3 million viewers, including one of the most important viewers may have been Jay Stewart, who was then a 21-year-old lesbian. Watching this program quite coincidentally made Jay Stewart think, possibly, I've also been born in the wrong body. And then subsequently, of course, Jay Stewart went to Goldsmiths, imbibed queer theory, and became the founder of the very important, influential organization, Gendered Intelligence. So I think in Jay Stewart's life, we have this perfect illustration of the importance, not just of queer theory, but of not just of Judith Butler, but also of Cohen-Kettenis. In terms of the adoption in Britain, it was very delayed because de Chelier, who was the long-term director of the Gender Identity Development Unit, which was the clinic in Britain for kids with gender dysphoria, he was very resistant to hormonal intervention under 16. And the documentary shows him saying to Fred, look, you might be certain now at the age of 13, but how do you know you're going to feel the same way in a year or two? So de Chelier really resisted this mounting pressure from some academics and from parents groups like Mermaids. But the pressure was overwhelming. And when Polly Carmichael took over become director of what was GIDS, the Gender Identity Development Service as it was renamed, she immediately embarks on a program of puberty suppression, which originally starts out as a kind of a experiment for children aged 12 to 15, and then very quickly becomes rolled out to younger ages. I've written quite a few things with Transgender Trend about this experiment begun in 2011, so I won't say anything more about that. I've also published in the book edited by Heather Brunskill-Evans and Michelle Moore, and Transgender Trend has compiled some of my blog posts, which you can download from their website. But I just want to say one thing in terms of just in the interest of time, and that is to talk about reversibility. And this ties in with the rhetoric of reversibility I mentioned in terms of the Dutch. So at the beginning, Carmichael was very straightforward in reflecting the uncertainty, the scientific uncertainty of puberty blockers. As she says, the debate revolves around the reversibility of this intervention, physical and also psychological, in terms of the possible influence of sex hormones on brain and identity development. Likewise, in the protocol that was used for this experiment on puberty suppression, there's a fairly, I think, fair summary of the scientific literature. It is not clear what the long-term effects of early suppression may be on bone development, height, etc., and their reversibility if treatment is stopped during pubertal development. Now that's good. However, as soon as the experiment was approved, the Tavistock and Portman NHS Trust put out a press release which immediately says this intervention, which is deemed reversible, And again, you don't have to be very skilled at textual analysis to realize deeming something reversible is a way of saying that you've got no evidence that it's reversible at all. The passive voice is wonderful there. Who's doing the deeming, and on what basis is the deeming being done is not clear. Then Polly Carmichael goes on to another important television program called I Am Leo, which features one of the patients in this experiment on puberty suppression. And this is a documentary that is specifically targeted at 6 to 12-year-olds. And Polly Carmichael says, the good thing about puberty suppression is, if you stop the injections, it's like pressing a start button, and the body just carries on developing as it would if you hadn't taken the injection. And to really ram this home to the little kids watching, they actually have an animation where Leo is stopped, is sort of paused, and then there's a pause button, then the start button is hit, and Leo comes to life again, just to make it just how clear to these little kids just how reversible puberty blockers are. Then, remarkably enough, a year later, Carmichael then says, the blockers is said to be completely reversible, which is disingenuous because nothing's completely reversible, even though, of course, she had been on television 1 year earlier saying that it was reversible. It might be that the introduction of natal hormones at puberty has an impact on the trajectory of gender dysphoria. So I think we have in the succession of quotes an example of how this rhetorical sleight of hand is used, the rhetoric of reversibility, as a crucial part of the technology of puberty blockers. Now, I think I do want to just very briefly close with what happened to B, because of course, B was the case, the first patient that was used to advertise just what a wonderful sex change puberty suppression provided. So B is followed up at age 35. And if you read the abstract of the article, it looks pretty good. He indicated no regrets about his treatment. Negative side effects are limited. However, if you go beyond the abstract to read the text, it doesn't quite seem so good, particularly because B was depressed and B had broken up with the girlfriend. B considered it likely that his need to distance himself from her had been related to his shame about his genital appearance and his feelings of inadequacy in sexual matters. Which is strange because you'd think that shame about your genital appearance is a kind of gender dysphoria. And yet the authors conclude gender reassignment is highly effective in relieving gender dysphoria. Although they say it's no panacea, especially in the area of intimate relationships, and may remain difficult to find a suitable partner and overcome one's own barriers. So it's interesting that they don't see this as a problem with a treatment. The problem is in B, and gender reassignment has worked perfectly. It's just simply that B has their own barriers. And I suspect that shame about his genital appearance and feelings of inadequacy in sexual matters will not be the kind of thing that is featured in BBC children's documentaries about transgender kids. So let me just conclude then. Then what I've argued is that puberty blockers is a kind of medical technology for creating transgender children. And then just to underline that, I'm not saying it creates gender dysphoria, but rather gender dysphoria clearly exists before puberty blockers, but nevertheless, it's part of this technology for creating what we now see as the transgender child. I've emphasized the pivotal role of Horan and Cohen-Kettenis in the 1990s, and I think they're sort of neglected figures, particularly Cohen-Kettenis. This is not just a simple drug, but a discursive package, which includes the rhetorical tricks that get around the problems of consent and the serious sort of principles of age of consent. Those tricks being saying that puberty blockers are diagnostic and that they're reversible. There's also part of this is the kind of the erasure of sexuality, especially homosexuality. I think just to finish with one sort of speculative point, one perhaps critical point, you could say, well, actually, only a minority of transgender children take puberty blockers, so aren't you exaggerating their importance? What I would say is that I think the very existence of puberty suppression facilitates a kind of cross-sex fantasy. And the fantasy is much more plausible even for adults, to think, I could have become the opposite sex had I not been forced to endure the wrong puberty. So in the subjunctive mood, that possibility, that apparent counterfactual, helps to build the notion of being born in the wrong body, even if you haven't yourself gone through puberty suppression.